Welcome back to One Set of Footprints. I'm Matthew, and today we're stepping into a conversation that sits right at the heart of what this podcast is all about: care, identity, power, and the system that shape our lives. I'm joined by someone who is really special to me, who's not just working in the fostering world, but actively trying to reshape it. Tim, founder of Free Circles. Tim, thank you for being here, mate. Really.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Yeah.
I just want to have a conversation with you about obviously how you got into fostering in the first place and how you started Free Circles.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it goes back many years. I'm actually a qualified teacher, not a social worker. And really my first interest when I worked in secondary schools was unusual in the sense that I had a natural interest in children who either weren't there or who were struggling, rather than children who found achievement and education, sort of successful. I then left that job and worked with young offenders in a unit which was about working with children to prevent them, ending up in youth offending institutions, but it was also to prevent children coming into care, which was an interesting mix. It was the days where you mixed the prevention of children coming into care alongside young offenders, which was bizarre looking back on it. After that, I then became part of the care system when I was appointed to be a deputy principal in what they termed a therapeutic community, which was an incredibly large residential home for children who literally had nowhere else to go. That appointment changed my life, changed my perspective on the care system, because at that point I officially became part of it.
Yeah. What was the moment or the wound that first made you feel the care system needed disturbing or changing?
Well, because an observation I had was that it didn't work. It was fascinating because the residential establishment that I became eventually the principal of was right at the end of the line. These were, from a social work perspective, these were children who the system considered could not go into foster homes. And if they had been fostered, the foster placements would continually break down. They would then enter small residential homes in the city, and when those placements break down, the social work perspective was that they needed therapeutic intervention in a specialist service. Mm-hmm. Educationally, the same children were those who had entered mainstream schools, been excluded from them, then entered the special school system, then got excluded from special schools, very often ended up in residential special schools, and were then excluded from those as well. The mental health professionals who at some point along the line assessed these children all reached the same conclusion, that these were children who required 24-hour, 52-week-a-year therapeutic intervention in a residential resource. So the first observation that I made was that you have three different groups of professionals: educationalists, social workers, and mental health professionals. And none of whom knew each other, none of whom, they all came from a different training perspective, they operated cultures, they had different expectations, but they'd all agreed on one thing, that they had caught a group of children who, to put it bluntly, were incapable of everything. They couldn't live in homes with foster carers, they couldn't attend local schools, they literally had nowhere to go. So therefore, the fascination for me was, okay, we've now got them. What is it that we are now going to do that's going to change their lives? The bit that I did understand was that the system never expected anything of us. What they expected us to do was to contain the children that we had been given on referral, thereby solving nothing for them, but solving the problem for the schools, the foster carers, and all those parts of what you might call normal services that had in effect rejected them. So my first issue was, and I was part of an incredibly well-resourced therapeutic community, was one, to understand what that meant, what was therapeutic about what we were then meant to do. what were we then going to do to these children to change their lives for the good the older they got? Because they weren't going to stay in this institution until they were, 60, 70, 80 years old. At some point, they had to go back out into the very communities that had, in effect, rejected them. So my passion came for really about that immediate question. What, with all the resources we have, the teachers, the social workers, the psychologists that we employed to work with these children, how were those tasks going to be defined, and what was our operational practice going to be that changed the situation those children were in? And I became very frustrated because it seemed to me that was not the way forward, that this was, in a sense, purely about containing children. And we had referral after referral where basically we were full up because other professionals had no answer. And all of those social workers and educationists had moved on to other children. So we're left with these children with nowhere to go. And we had an on-site school. My job at the time was to educate them on site. And I was very uneasy about that because it was anything but normal. The change for me came when the city council decided eventually to close that establishment, not because it wasn't considered to be working, but really it was about saving money and wanting to relocate some of those services back within the city council's borders. Mm-hmm. And that's when I took what I now look back on was a fairly dramatic decision in one summer many, many years ago, because what the social workers did when they found out the establishment was going to close, they did what everybody does. Any children that could possibly be moved were moved, and we were left within this residential home with 29 children who were stuck there. They couldn't go home, they couldn't be fostered, all the things that I previously mentioned. And I got those children together in one summer, and I said to them, in September, when the teachers come back off their extraordinary long holidays, there is no school here, right? You're now all going to go back into schools within Manchester, and you're not just going to go back to any school. You're going to go back to mainstream schools, right? And there was a deathly hush from this group of children. And I had this, I can't remember, don't ask me the actual statement. And I remember preparing myself for a child who's going to be brave enough to say, well, I'm not effing going and you can't make me. But none of these kids said anything, but they were stunned into silence. And we literally converted our teachers overnight into support teachers and negotiated with mainstream schools in Manchester to give these children a chance. And by the September, we had mainstream school places arranged for every one of those children that were conditional on us providing support. So some schools said, just give us 2 or 3 of them, we'll have a go. Others said, look, if you can sit with them and you can be handcuffed to the child, in effect, we will take a risk on it. It wasn't easy, but we did manage to find school places for those children at that time.
Why do you think it is so hard to get those children like school places? Is it because like them being disruptive? I'm just trying to think of what I was like in school, and obviously me being like care experience as a child. I didn't grow up in care like your children, but obviously I spent from 18 months to me being 4 in care. So I spent the main years of my development in care, and then obviously growing up and like being adopted and the difficulties that brought. I was disruptive at school. I think anyone who knows me can say that. My teachers would definitely agree with that. So it did have an effect on other classmates, and then obviously it wrecks the school's report in a way as well.
It upsets other children, it upsets other parents. But look, the immediate answer to your question is that I was dealing with 29 children who had legally binding assessments, right? They were, at the time, they were called statements of special education need, that set out all the reasons why these children couldn't go to mainstream schools and that their needs could only be met in a much smaller special school setting, which ended up being the school that I was running within the residential home. So I not only had the problem of persuading mainstream schools to give these children a chance who had previously been disruptive in those schools and been kicked out, I was also flying against the legalities of all the professionals who'd assessed these children and who were telling me and telling the children that their needs cannot be met in a mainstream school. And I was only able to do this actually because of the fact the system was not that interested once we got the kids on what we really did with them. And I was able to negotiate, we were able to negotiate with schools to give these children another chance. Now, that led to a series of dramatic developments that changed the way I looked at the care system almost overnight. Because in September, when all those children started going to school, and some of them got kicked out, we got them back in. So it wasn't a kind of an experiment that, in a sense, was 100% successful straight away, but it was significantly successful in that the overwhelming majority of those children did go back to mainstream schools with a huge amount of support from the teachers that we had. And did well. Now, how do you think the system reacted to these children who'd previously been rejected by those schools, suddenly going to those schools quite successfully? Well, I'll tell you what they did. The education list changed the assessment. They'd previously said cannot go to a mainstream school. They then rewrote the assessment and said they can now go to a mainstream school with support. They'd not said that 2 years before. The social work perspective was the most interesting one, because social workers who'd assessed these children as needing this therapeutic community for 52 weeks a year were then saying, well, some of these children can now be fostered, because the reason the foster placements kept breaking down was the fact that they weren't going to school. And if they're not going to school and they're creating mayhem within communities, you can't expect a foster parents to look after them successfully. Now they're going to school, they can be fostered again, right? And of those 29 children, I think something like 18 of them were placed back into foster care in the period that we were preparing to close the whole establishment, okay? And they were going back to foster care, having previously been described as unfosterable, because they started going to school, right? Same children, different assessments, because we placed the children in a different situation and given them the support they needed in the way that they needed it. Now, that was
they
huge.
just wanted to get treated like their peers, basically.
Yeah, well, it was huge, because the care system was assessing these children as being incapable when they weren't incapable. They just needed the right kind of support and the right kind of belief or ethos behind them, which was, no, you are capable of going to school like other children, but you're going to need support. And many of those children were really successful in those schools when we were previously told they had a statement of special education needs, so they can't go to school. Interestingly, the mental health professionals, having assessed the children as being incapable and requiring therapeutic intervention, they disappeared. And one of the problems with the childcare system is that the more highly paid you are and the more status you have, the less involvement you have with children. So your consultant psychiatrist who knows children possibly for an hour, 2 hours when they're assessing them, wield a huge amount of power over these children, whereas residential workers, foster carers who have these children 24 hours a day, they are the least powerful people within the system.
Yeah.
But it was that experience in that residential establishment, which eventually closed down, that told me that we had all these kids in the wrong place for the wrong reasons. And the big lie in the care system was that they're with you because we've assessed their needs as requiring a residential establishment 52 weeks a year. It was nothing to do with children's needs. It was everything to do with the failure of the system. And the system failed, and the assessment of the child followed that, right? Child gets excluded from mainstream school, therefore go into a special school. foster placements break down, therefore go into a children's home. Those children's break down, they end up with me in a residential therapeutic establishment, all because we didn't support them. The foster care was the wrong service. Mainstream schools weren't particularly good at dealing with these children, and the victims of the inadequacies of these provisions were the children. And we simply blame the children. We said, we're just meeting the children's needs.
Still do today. I'm
Absolutely.
having that experience.
And I hated that. I hated it, and I still do. And I haven't lost that, 25 years ago.
It comes on to my next question as well, actually, So it's like trauma-informed everywhere now. It's almost like become a branding. So you've got trauma-informed versus trauma-responsive. So like whenever, like with me being adopted, obviously I stood in front of a judge, did my adoption order. He sat there being trauma-informed. So he's had all of these assessments from psychologists, social workers, all of these people saying that I'm going to need this trauma response in the future, so I'm going to need counselling, I'm going to need the support, X, Y, and Z support. None of it get put into place until later in my life when I'm going to look for it, and it's all like the system's been exhausted in the aspect of me getting kicked out of my house, me getting prison, like I said to you before, or me getting, when I drinking loads at school, getting kicked out of school. It's all responsive rather than actually responding to that child's needs there and then, like how Free Circles do. They actually don't label a child. So I was going to ask, how do you not label that child? So obviously all the children you get, and I think 90% of the children that go into care, whether it's emergency care or even residential care in the UK, have suffered some sort of horrific abuse, sadly. So they are going to be traumatized. So how do we do it from a trauma-informed versus a trauma response aspect?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with those terms, Matt. So if I can answer that question in a slightly different way, you're right about the reasons children come into care. And that's politically, that's one of the weaknesses in the system, is that professionals have always got an explanation for failure. Okay, so whether you look at outcomes for young adults who've been in care for many years, and we know the outcomes are appalling. They're appalling in terms of level of offending, when very few have ever committed an offence at the point they enter the care system. We know they disproportionately feed unemployment statistics, homelessness, mental health difficulties, teenage pregnancies, all the negative statistics that you can invent on young adults. I can guarantee children in the care system will disproportionately feed. Now, the explanation for that in many professionals, they won't necessarily be thinking it overtly day to day, but the system says, well, it's what you expect of children that come from these backgrounds. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the low expectations of these kids, because they've been through that trauma, is the whole system is not aspirational. It does not focus on the skills and talents that these children have. It doesn't focus on the fact they have dreams like my kids had dreams and wanting to be, to aspire to a certain career or a lifestyle or whatever. That's gone. We don't treat the care system isn't structured like that. It's actually structured to contain and have low expectations of kids. It's the only possible explanation for failure, because if it were true that children fail because of the demographic they come from, then what are we doing? We're just wasting our time, right? But it's so not true, because these children, and I've worked with thousands over the years, they are as skilled and as talented as any other group of children. The difference is in their circumstances, because they face the kind of life conditions that I wouldn't be speaking to you now if I'd faced. And that's the reality of it. So part of the problem I face in being part of the care system is that I'm still to this day part of a care system that doesn't believe, not what I believe, it's not about me, but doesn't have that aspirational, it's not structured to exploit children's talents and dreams. It's structured to solve problems for the grown-ups. It solves problems for the grown-ups, and it always has done. And I want to see that change. I don't even think it's that difficult.
No,
Because when you
I completely agree. And I think with education, and I know you're very educational driven because obviously your history around education, Tim. But like I was saying to you when I was speaking to you before, it needs to be more like hands-on as well as having that TA support with these children. So that if they do, say, you did that example of obviously trying to get placements for your children. If you did do that and it failed, then they do have a second option of being able to go and do a mechanics apprenticeship in a garage somewhere, or like some sort of trade. So they are doing something like practical.
couldn't agree with you more. Yeah, yeah.
Like, so they are doing something practical, so they have got something to then go into life and make a difference with. Me being an example, obviously, I became a plasterer at 19, now been running my own business for the last 5 years, earning more money than what some people who I went to school with and did A levels and that with. So, like, it is proof. I'm living proof that you can go and be from a crap background and go and make something from yourselves. 100%. I just wanted to go over, because obviously we were just talking about obviously the link between like the worst statistics. Just quickly, over 25% of adults prison population are care experience. More than 50% of young people in custody, so in young offenders, have been in care. 1 in 3 care leavers become homeless within 2 years. That's a link between all of these like bad things, and it's a cost to them. So, like you were saying, how much would it cost to have an extra TA for one of your children in school?
Peanuts compared with the cost of not doing it. There's no doubt about that. But I think what we've not done, because those statistics that you've mentioned have not improved that much over the last 20 years. And when you consider the political focus on outcomes, that's probably gone off the boil now. We used to talk a lot about this when Ofsted inspected 4 local authorities and found that the outcomes for children in care were disastrous. Things have improved slightly, but not much. We still scandalously fail these children. And I think that what nobody's done is to look at the construct of the care system. So rather than we glibly say the care system, well, what does it consist of, right? Now, it consists of foster care, which is entirely a social work-led, managed and delivered activity, right? When you use the term foster care, you're making a social work statement. You're not saying anything about education, and don't misread my commitment to education. It's not just about GCSEs and A levels and university. It is about the kind of education and becoming a plasterer wherever your skills, wherever your talents lie. And schools aren't necessarily that good at seeing individual talents in all kids, so that's a separate conversation. But I would love to see education introduced into the fostering service. And the reason I feel passionate about this is because if you look at what works, right, what stops people being unemployed, what helps their mental health, what stops them going into prison, this, that, and the other, education is one of the only things that we know works, right? So educated young people do not tend to end up unemployed or homeless and feed those other negative statistics. It's also about the child in care really doing what other children do, which is to go to school. So I make no apology for emphasizing the school bit, because we've got a system at the moment that stigmatizes, right? When we get referrals for children to be considered for placement with our carers, they are all diagnosed with all sorts of, ADHD, autism, and I'm not in any way belittling those assessments, because we do need to look at the difficulties that young people face. But we're very, very good at spelling out what children can't do and to give them what you might call a negative diagnosis. And those negative diagnoses often prevent their access to what I would call normal services and normal provisions. So you've got, on the one hand, a care system which stigmatizes, which treats children as and is more likely to lead to their failure because they're not really capable of doing what my children do or what your children can do. On the other hand, what I feel passionate about is wanting them to have access to what you might call a normalizing agenda, where these children do what other children do. And going to school's a massive part of that. And that, if you can provide high quality education alongside foster care, different debates, and it may even be one where you and I would see the world slightly differently, but I think that is hugely therapeutic. So when you start looking at trauma and you start looking at abuse, and you then enter that difficult debate, how do you best help a young person who's suffered that trauma and that abuse live with that? You never ever make them forget it, but you can help them survive. Well, the resilience that education can give you, and the confidence and the feeling that you get from doing what other children do and living in a high quality foster home, there's something intensely therapeutic about that. And I don't think that we've in any way exploited that, because
No,
we still have
100%, 100%, mate.
Yeah.
I like, whilst we're just speaking about education as well, just because I've got a statistic here off the government website.
Yeah.
So only 7% of children in care get 5 GCSEs at grade 4 to 9, which is an A to C equivalent. Education is disrupted by moves, trauma and instability. Children in care are 5 times more likely to be excluded. Behaviour linked to trauma is punished and not understood. So I was just wondering there, just from that statistic, because this happened to me, is how informed are schools of the trauma that child who has in care has experienced?
Well, it's variable. I mean, schools are like people. Some are really, really good. Others don't want to know, but you're certainly right in implying that the training of teachers is not geared up to the issues that children in the care system face on a day by day basis. So there's certainly a deficit there. But again, there's something that the care system could address that. I mean, the care system put together has a huge amount of resources, but they're all in different pockets.
Yeah.
And again, if you got the care system investing in education by providing high quality, teachers who are trained in those issues, who were able to give support to schools and individual children, you would make a massive difference rather than simply rely on schools without that external form of support. So it's easy to blame schools, and I do blame them for a lot, but they are, like a lot of other services, under-resourced, under-trained. In a way, they can't become experts in literally everything.
No,
but the care system could provide that. You could provide that externally, 100%. And I think that's what we do. That's what we try and do. Yeah.
That is exactly what Free Circle is trying to do. And the problem is, I think the government, and when it's in a public residential setting, where, say, if you're in a residential home under the care of Devon County Council, just putting it close to me, then you're not going to get those needs met compared to if you're in a private care home like you're running, just because obviously they don't fund it, and it's criminal because them not funding it back then, they are forced to fund it in later stages of life. Like I was saying on my Facebook yesterday, £1.3 billion is spent every single year on either an adult or a young person who's in the young offenders on the prison system. £1.3 billion a year. So that could be put in towards education and support and trauma-informed support, but no, it doesn't. It just gets put into the prison system because once someone goes into prison, that bill got to be paid.
We're not a care home; we're a fostering agency. But what we do in Free Circles is, we're part of a system. The reality is local authorities, fund us to provide foster homes for their children. Mm-hmm. But what we as an organisation do is we invest directly in our children's education. So we don't charge local authorities for that. And therein lies the problem. If we did, social services would say, well, that's not our job. Education has to be funded by the education department. And the education department would say, well, child in care, no, that's social services job, not ours. So the funding for these children in terms of their education would fall right down the middle between two departments who try and offload responsibility onto the other. So because we believe very strongly that our children's education is crucial in terms of their life chances, then Three Circles as an agency employs full-time teachers whose sole job is to provide that value-added extra support to all children within the agency. And that support will look very different from child to child. Some will need a huge amount of support. Others will need a light touch. Some will need advice on GCSEs, entrance to university. Others may need extra help for tuition for English, maths, or in particular subjects of interest to them, or, shortfalls in their own education. But the key thing there is that fostering is seen not as a standalone service, but as a hybrid service that includes education. Therein lies the normalising bit. I can say with confidence that we've got 192 children. I'd be staggered if we had a child who wasn't in school. In fact, if we've got children who are not in school, it'll be because they're 1 year old or 3 years old. Yeah. But all children of school age in Three Circles will be in school, because we make sure that we've got resourcing in place to make sure that happens, because that's crucial for the child, right? So that changes the nature of foster care. And of course, foster parents themselves love that, because if their children placed with them are going to the local school and hopefully doing well there, that's a massive way of supporting foster parents who do a really difficult job. So everybody wins. And if you can stabilise a child in terms of education and foster care, you're taking away the need for them to go into a children's home at a far higher cost. And then, because the reality is, I don't know what the statistics are, but I can pretty much guarantee that if you look at however many thousand children there are in children's homes, most of them will not be attending school. That's how bad it is. Right, children who go to children's homes don't tend to go successfully to school. I hope I'm wrong on that, but I suspect I'm not. Right. So you're preventing huge costs in terms of children moving from foster care into group care, and when those placements break down into highly expensive external placements, which can be costing you £5,000, £6,000, £7,000 a week per child, of which there's always an outcry. There's always an outcry in terms of all the amount of money that councils are spending on all these terrible kids. Yeah, you're spending that because you're not getting your fostering service operating as a way it should be to prevent that happening, right? So, it's like every part of the service prevents a more expensive part of the system. But the more money you spend on these kids for more restrictive parts of the system, you increase the probability of failure. Because it's obvious, if you can get a child in foster care being educated successfully, the outcome for that group of children is going to be much better than those children who go into children's homes, because we've considered that they can't be fostered. Yep. Right. So that's the frustration, is that there's millions and millions of pounds being spent shoring up failure because we're not prepared to invest in the least restrictive part of the care system, which is foster care, right? Not as good foster care as staying within your own family, but it's the next best thing. And we need to think about fostering very, very differently to how it's traditionally been looked at. And we never have done that. If you're a child living in foster care 30 years ago, your experience of being in care won't be that much different to being in foster care now.
That's scary.
It is, isn't it? It is
what I experienced.
Yeah. It is, because the education is something that the education department does, not social services. And they're part of the same council, but they very, very rarely, operationally, work together. But I know they don't work together.
It's shocking. Just to give you a little statistic as well of what you were just talking about, 40% of children in care are persistently absent from school compared to only around 20% of other pupils.
Yeah. Yeah. And why is that? Because the kids aren't capable of it, or they're stupid, or because we're not supporting them in the right way. Well, I know the answer to that. There's certainly not 40% of our kids being out of school system. Nothing like. I'd be surprised we got more than one, to be honest. Because last time I asked, was about 3 weeks ago, we had no children outside the school system. As I say, it doesn't
how many children?
195, I think we had last week. Yeah.
So out of 195 children, you don't have any out of the care system. It'd be really.
No, we don't have any out of the school system.
I'm sorry, any out of the school system.
Unless they're not of school age. So
Yeah,
we'll
obviously.
have the odd 3-year-old.
Yeah. If they're under 5, it's a bit different. What would be really interesting, is if you could do some way for free circles to keep an eye on these children going into adulthood. So what effect does it have when they're 25 by having all of this education? That would be really interesting to see in the aspect of then comparing it to national statistics. So you can then prove what you're doing, Tim, is working.
Well, we kind of do. I mean, what we say to all of our kids, because as you'll know from personal experience, Matt, the care system the care population is not a static population. So, kids come into the care system and go out of it. We have children placed with us who maybe move on after a year. We have many kids who stay with us year after year after year. So, you're looking at a fairly mobile group, and whether they stay with us for years on end is a local authority care plan decision, not our decision, which is sad in a way. But it's one of the realities. But we say to all of our kids, if you've been part of Three Circles, you have a lifelong, for as long as you want, we are here for you. So you can come back to us for advice. We can speak to you on the phone. We'll give you any practical help we can, even when you're 30, 22, whatever. And we do quite a lot of that follow-up. So we do know what happens to quite a few of our kids, although we don't know all of them. And many of them end up, as you would hope, employed. We've got a qualified social worker who's now working for Newcastle Council, who used to be fostered by us, who did extremely well. What I can guarantee is that the outcomes for our kids are not 100% fantastic, but what they are will be much, much better than the national statistics. We had 4 years ago, we had 33% of our kids. No, in fact, 44% of our kids went to university. That's unheard of in the care system.
You need to find out for me, and then we'll do another podcast on it. It would be. I am really intrigued to know, just because the difference that it makes. Just hearing you say that even a 33-year-old can come and get support off you. I'm massively struggling with that. Like, I was talking to you about before we started this podcast, trying to get any kind of support, getting your care records, trying to get any kind of trauma support, anything like that is non-existent down in Devon. So I'm now, as an adopted adult who's experienced sexual abuse, neglect and physical abuse as a child, which DCC knew about, which I'm more than happy to say.
Yeah,
I have to deal with all of that on my own. I have to get through that on my own, which isn't good for your mental health or your stability. And luckily for me, I do have 3 beautiful kids and a missus and a nice little family to keep me grounded. But it is these lack of people who don't have that, and then end up getting into addiction or drinking or going into prison. It's such a backward system. So you doing that support for people who are above 18 is amazing.
Well, it's obviously up to them to take us up on it, because as you know, Matt, when you're 18, you're no longer in care, you're an adult, and you can vote with your feet and do whatever you want. But what the message we're giving is, you don't, to any young person who's been part of Three Circles, is that you don't have to be alone, that we're here as an organisation to help and support you. And that is not something that is financially driven. We don't obviously get a penny for that. That's a human to human commitment, because the kids that we foster matter to us. It's why we do what we do,
But they're not going to go around thinking that everything's their fault, like I am this week. Because because they're getting that support. Where if you're not getting support and you're getting ignored, like I have been by Devon County Council, it's just making you feel like everything's your fault. You got abused, that's your fault. It's the child's problem, like you said, is solving the problem for the adult.
I'm 90%. I'm 90% certain that if you'd been fostered by Three Circles, you probably would have spent an inordinate of time sitting in our office alongside one of my colleagues, banging away with them, trying to get the answers that you want. In other words, we would not have said to you, sorry, you're on your own, pal. If it mattered to you, it would have mattered to us. In fact, we did have a situation only about 3 months ago where someone who left our care wanted their care records off us, and we acted on it straight away. Yes, we had to tell the local authority that's what we were doing, but we did it, and that young person now has all the care records that we held on them,
and they got support
internally. Sorry?
And they got support going through it.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. They came to us, and we know that person really well. She was fostered by us for many years. She still keeps in contact with us. She can come and have a brew with us anytime. The door's always open, and that's the way it should be. I mean, none of this guarantees that all of your young people are going to end up being, roaring successes in terms of their personal and professional lives and this, that, and the other. But what the system can do is to organize itself in such a way as to maximize the possibility of success. Because that's all you can do as a parent, mate, and that's all I can do.
Yeah.
You can't. You don't know how your kids are going to turn out when they're 25 any more than I knew how my kids were.
No, but I can make sure
control that.
No,
but
I can make sure he goes to school. I can make sure
you can control the opportunities that you give them.
Exactly, yeah.
You can control how much you believe in them and how positive you feel about them, and listen to them and listen to their dreams and aspirations and work on that. If you simply sit at home with them thinking you're just three little gits and you're just a problem, I'm pretty much guarantee that they're not going to turn out quite as well as if you think the opposite. So, and that's all we can do in the system is to think positively and build on these kids' positives, because they have them. It's the adults in the care system that don't. I don't blame them individually, but the system needs a revolution. It does not need to evolve. We've had enough of evolution. You get nowhere. It needs a revolution. It needs someone with an imagination to sit down and say, we need to construct a care system that is fit for purpose, that gives the child in care a different experience based on a different ethos and a different culture. I can't see it happening in my lifetime, but I'm going to shout about it until,
hopefully, which I'll get into in a minute, because it has been in the news recently, fosterers. But I do want to put one thing, because I think us having this conversation and me doing these podcasts and me obviously looking up stats, which have been mind blowing over the last 2 years of me doing my podcast. What I've noticed with every single stat, it's always 16 to 24, 18 to 21. It's always young people, and obviously it's always the lack of education. So it's like we were just talking about employment. Care leavers in stable employment by the age of 21, only 25%. So what's happening before they're 21 for them not to be able to get a job? Well, they're obviously not getting to school and getting that education, are they? Which then screams what we were just literally talking about.
Yeah.
So it does make a massive difference, and having that support in place when they're older and have someone to go to is a massive difference. I wish I was fostered by Three Circles, mate. Honestly, Tim, because if it would be like with me today, where I've hit my head against a brick wall all week, tried ringing Adopt Southwest, they've got a line that's open from 11 to 1, so can't talk to them. My counsellor's ignoring me at the moment, so can't talk to her. Devon County Council are ignoring me at the moment, so can't talk to them. So who of authority of anyone who understands foster care can I speak to? No one. So it's a very lonely world, and no wonder why these statistics of addiction, homelessness, prison are so high. It's because everyone thinks it's their fault, and then they go and do something stupid or mental health. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah. I mean, you can actually sum it up incredibly easily. That kids in care, the overwhelming probability is that they will not end up in a good place as adults. There are only two possibilities there. One, it is the kid's fault. The other is that it's the system's fault, right? And all I want is for someone to say in a government level or someone who's got the ability to change things, it is clearly the system that's failing. What do we need to do to change that system to increase the probability of success for children? Because it ain't kids' fault. I absolutely know it isn't, and it's like banging our heads up against a brick wall, but then we can't stop banging our heads up because if we don't, nothing will ever change. We can only do what we do, can't we? But it makes me so angry because kids deserve better than we're giving them.
About them doing 10,000 wanting to have 10,000 new foster placements or fosters for children. Do you think what Josh, I can't remember his surname now, Family and Child's Minister announced yesterday, do you think that's going to help foster agencies like yourself recruit more foster agencies, and do you think it's going far enough?
I don't think it'll help us specifically. I think any campaign that increases the number of people available for fostering, it has to be welcomed. The problem I have with that is that all of the initiatives that I heard about were already in place. In other words, that in single people can foster. You can foster if you rent your own home. So all the things that he was implying would change. They're already an established part of the system. I suppose that the thing about foster carers is that, again, we need to look at the carers that we lose, because there's a turnover of foster carers, and the way foster carers are supported is a key issue. And believe you me, it's not just about what they're paid, it's about the way we support our foster carers to work with our children. So again, another long-winded answer off me, but I welcome any initiative to get more foster carers, because the more people available to foster has to be a good thing. But I don't see anything that I heard, or I didn't hear anything yesterday that makes me feel particularly encouraged that he came up with any of the answers. I think rather we need to look at the nature of the fostering service we provide and what that looks like.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it needs a massive overhaul. The whole system needs a massive overhaul.
I mean, there's a huge debate, which we probably haven't got time for now, which is about how you actually support foster carers. Because what we've noticed, and we're very lucky, that an awful lot of carers leave other private agencies and come and join us. And they always say the same thing, that they don't get the support that they feel they need. They're doing a really difficult job, and they often feel as if they're just cash cows. They're working for companies who are solely interested in making money, and that affects the quality of support they get. I'm proud of the fact that we don't lose our carers who go to them. But that's, I wouldn't want any credit for that, because our sole legal function is to recruit people to foster, look after them and professionally develop them in the interests of children placed with them. That's our job. So if we're not supporting foster carers in the right way, we're actually failing at the very reason we exist in the first place. So there's that debate about how you actually do that and your attitudes to foster carers and how well supported they feel. Then there's other debates. Maybe it's a future podcast about where Ofsted come in on all this, because what Ofsted inspect isn't necessarily what someone like me wants them to expect. I want them to inspect organisations for what they produce for children and young people, not to be infatuated with the fact that you missed a supervision or one of your admin records is slightly out of date. I want them to focus on what works for children and young people. That's what they should be inspecting, the quality of our practice and what that means for young people. So there needs to be a revolution there in terms of the way we're inspected and what we're accountable for.
It would just be nice if everyone just came together. It'd be nice if you had the education department, social work, social services department, all coming together for the better of these kids, because it would save both of them so much money in the long run. It's unreal. And I just don't think no one sees that wider picture yet with who's within the system. I think there's too many people who are within the system who are just in the system for a job and not in the system because of the love of it, like you are, Tim.
Yeah, and they probably individually all want to make a difference, but they're part of a system that doesn't allow them to make a difference. And I am very defensive of social workers in general and teachers in general. What I don't like about them is that they blame each other. So you get teachers who think, well, if only social services will get their act together, life will be wonderful. And then you get social workers who complain, well, if only schools were better informed about these children, life would be wonderful. Rather than say, what can we do to actually improve things? So rather than sit on your arse and blame some other profession, look at your own profession and say, how can we do things differently and better? And that mindset of improvement needs to be, introduced in all local authorities and nationally to redesign a care system that you won't talk to anybody, Matt, who disagrees with you that the care system's failing. And that's another frustration. Everybody knows it's failing, but nobody does anything about it other than tinker at the edges for, let's get 10,000 more foster carers, as if that's going to improve your prison statistics. It won't at all. You've got to do far more than that. But yeah, I know.
It's everything that we speak about for the last hour, all mixed into one big mixing bowl, which
It
will make
is, mate. It is.
and I just don't think people see it. And because people don't, I think because it's not talked about enough, and I think because care providers and the people who've been in care. I think there's a bit of a taboo about being in care, and I think there's a
Yeah.
bit of a taboo about being around other people who are not in care and that you being different and all this lot. So you don't really, I never really spoke about it in front of my friends when I was younger about being in care and being adopted. So
Yeah.
it needs to be talked about more, and then I think maybe people will understand. It's a bit like when I'm going out shopping and my daughter has a meltdown because she's autistic and she gets like sensory overload sometimes. I'll walk round with her talking about her having autism, so people around me who are staring at her know that she's got autism and stop staring at her. I've noticed that it works, so that's what I do. So like talking about something, it creates that, it removes that stigma, and I think people in care need to talk up more, and that's what I am. And it hopefully together, all of us together, can change this crappy system for the better.
I hope so, mate. And this, I'm pleased, but the care population is so small compared with the general school population that sadly it only raises its head when people talk about how much it costs. So you hear, oh God, local councils are spending an absolute fortune on adult care and on children's care, and then it looks at the private fostering sector, which is organisations like Three Circles, and somehow thinks that we're all running around trying to make millions of pounds on the back of vulnerable children. The truth is anything, well, just not like that. But the fact that spending money gets politicians' interest, not outcomes for children in care, tells you what you need to know. That we've got a long way to go before we start concentrating on the right things. And I actually believe the care system is very improvable at a cheaper cost to what we're spending now. We're just spending money on failure and on the wrong things, and we need to be spending money on preventing children go down to more and more restrictive, expensive provisions, which don't work. They don't work.
No, they don't. Well, a care leaver going into prison is not going to work, is it?
No.
And at the cost of £50,000 as well, by the way. So if you have a young person between 16 and 18 get into prison at the cost of £50,000, I wonder how much it would be to get them a TA in an education system.
But if you look at the average price of a per week of a child living in a children's home as opposed to being in foster care, you're talking £4,000, £5,000, £6,000 a week. Now, £5,000 a week is £250,000 a year. £250,000 a year will employ quite a few teachers, let alone TAs, who could do an awful lot of quality work within foster care that would prevent the need for that child to go into a children's home. Don't forget what I said earlier. When that child goes into the children's home, they never say the child needs a children's home because we weren't able to support the child's education when he was in foster care. They say the child's needs have changed. The blame is put on the child. The child's assessment is now they need a children's home. It's absolute nonsense. The child's needs haven't changed from day one. They need a high quality home, hopefully within their own family, but that we're not talking about that at the moment. But a high quality foster placement and a high quality education, that in itself is preventive, and it's far cheaper than putting a child elsewhere, and we've not even got that bit right.
No, and it's crazy. So here you go. Average annual cost per child in residential care, £318,000 per year.
Yeah.
They spend £3.1 billion between 2023 to 2024 just on kids in residential care, let alone what they're paying for prison systems, mental health.
Yeah,
it's got to be over £6-7 billion a year they're spending on people who've either been involved in the care system or currently in the care system. And then they're not willing to fund education or social services to counteract that. It's crazy.
But who pays the 318,000 social services, right? So to use that money on teachers, well, that's the education department. And the education department, why would they want to spend that money when they're saving social services? Because there's this gap between they're both part of the same council. right? And as I say, it's not that difficult to work out. You know, I certainly I'd be a very rich man if a council came to me and said, come in, tell us where we should be spending our money, and I'll say, okay, well, give me £1,000 for every 10,000 I save you. I'd be bloody rolling in it, I tell you. Yeah, and I buy you a pint as well, Matt. So
Yeah, I think we both deserve one, mate.
yeah,
It's crazy. It's just like the costs have almost doubled in 4 years, even though the number of children in residential care have only
yeah.
increased by 10%. Like, it's just, yeah. I know
Do you
obviously you've
have
got the cost of living and that as well, so it is going to go up year by year.
But 318,000 for one child for 1 year, that's more than the 250,000 that I thought it was. So, yeah, that's a lot of money, an awful lot of money, and that would employ an awful lot of staff to prevent that happening. Particularly, as you know, when you put a child in a children's home, it don't work anyway. It's about containing that child and keeping them out of someone else's hair. They're not going to leave a children's home and become a doctor or a plasterer or anything else. They're going to end up in a pretty hopeless situation. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's doubly mad. I mean, 318,000 a year. I spend every penny of that if it was on success and the child really benefited from it, but they don't. They don't. It's appalling, absolutely appalling.
Well, for that one child, that could get so many TAs for God knows how many children a year.
Oh yeah,
it could get so many people in a placement into like, you won't know this, but like Plymouth City College do because that's down in Plymouth. Go and do a mechanics course like I did at 16, or go and do a plastering course or a bricklaying course. God knows how many courses £318,000 will pay for.
Yeah,
it's so backwards.
And also mental health.
We?
I'm feeling a little bit neglectful in terms of the mental health dimension of this. I mean, although I do think that successful education is a massive help to anybody's mental health, but I also think that we should be funding access of young people when they choose to get it, from counsellors, from people they can talk to about their own trauma and their own abuse. I don't believe we should force that on them, but we should make that facility available to them. So I'm not ignoring that. But I actually think successful education, successful foster care in itself is diagnostic, because, I think that would have a massive impact. And yet some kids may need additional services alongside that. I'm not saying that's the be all and end all and would solve every problem.
No, I think it's just more like building up relationships and that around like having counselling, building up your like fear of relationships and things like that.
Absolutely.
Like, just going off aim personal views. And I agree, it shouldn't be forced upon them. But when you got what's really frustrating, because this still happens today, is when you've got social services and all these agencies doing all these reports so someone can get adopted or put into care, and then nothing happening for that child like down the line. So all of this, like, it's like what I was saying about my own experience. You know that they're going to need all this support because of what's happened to them, and then nothing actually be put in place, or nothing available to be put in place anyway. So it's just, it's crazy.
Yeah, because the only bits that we can place children in are the bits that have failed for the last 30, 40 years. In fact, I don't think there's never been a golden age for the care system. Let's not delude ourselves. We're not talking about one of those things that we're trying to get back to 1952 or whatever. There's never been a golden age for these kids, but there needs to be one. And there needs to be one because A, the children deserve that, and B, they're capable. That's the thing I want to scream more than anything else. These kids are capable, they're skilled, they're talented, they're no different from anybody else's children. And the fact that they don't perform as well as other people's children is not their fault. It's the fault of the system that they're made to be part of. So,
I agree. And I'm going to say this just as a care experienced person as well. Take care people out of it. The money involved, like it's got to be hitting for all the services that we've talked about and the cost of like prison, mental health, all of that lot. It's got to be hitting £10 billion a year. And then we've got people saying we're sitting here in a cost of living crisis. So there's a lot of money being wasted there in the care system that could be very very better off, well spent.
I hate anybody describing us as a business, but we're legally, we have to make a profit because local authorities are not allowed to use us. Local authorities aren't allowed to purchase anything that's loss making. So we have to make a profit in terms of what we do, but we still invest money back into our carers and back into our children, hence the education dimension. And we're also giving our carers private health insurance and all sorts of other things to make sure that they're properly looked after. So yeah, again, it's another
turn back
debate,
time. Get me fostered by you, Tim.
I think you're probably a little bit old now, Matt.
So I'm 34 next Tuesday, mate. So
wow,
sadly say, mate.
Wow. And you haven't even got a decent football team down there, have you? So,
let's not mention Plymouth Argyle, QPR.
QPR are playing tonight. They're away at Charlton, and I shall be watching. Hopefully, yeah. You never know. Oh, and to you. Well, listen, we're going to stay in touch with each other anyway.
Of course we are. But yeah, it has been good catching up with you, and thank you for coming on, Tim. It's been really great.
And you know what?
And that brings us to the end of today's episode with 3 Circles for Fostering. A huge thank you to Tim for joining us and bringing us his honesty, experience and heart into this space. Conversations like this matter, not just for carers or professionals, but for every single person who has ever been shaped by the care system. For me, this podcast is part of something much bigger. Through One Set of Footprints CIC, I'm fighting for truth, for accountability, and for the voices of care experienced adults finally to be heard, without fear or shame. Every story shared here is another step forward, a system that listens, learns, and does better. This is our first podcast of the year, but we have got so much coming up in the next 12 months. We have already announced that we have done the player sponsorship for Herbie Kane, which was awesome. As a massive Argyle fan, I was so excited to do that and work with Plymouth Argyle. There is also a competition that is now running on all social platforms for One Set of Footprints. We'll get a chance to win 2 tickets to the Plymouth Argyle player sponsorship meal. Really great chance to sit there, get to see the players and see me. You'll be coming with me. So yeah, be an awesome night. Really looking forward to that, to just experience that. The competition closes on the 9th and the winner will be announced on the 10th of March 2026. So good luck to everyone on that. And like I said, we've only just got started. Our next guest has been fostering for over 25 years, and they're bringing a conversation that cuts right to the core of this podcast. The good, the bad, and the places where the system still fails its children. The insight's deep, the experience is real, and the honesty is exactly what the space was built for. Because here's the truth, silence has a heartbeat. Talking keeps it alive. Every time we speak openly, every time we share these stories, we keep the conversation beating, we keep the truth moving, and we keep pushing for the change that should have happened a long time ago. So please like, share, and follow. The bigger the podcast, the bigger the guests, and the louder these voices become. Until next time, take care of yourself, hold compassion, close, and remember, every step forward leaves a footprint for someone else to follow.